Hi, I'm Dale Whittaker. I'm a senior program officer with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And prior to joining the foundation, I was a practitioner in higher education for over 3 decades, working in roles from professor to university president. Let me tell you a little bit about the foundation. The foundation at its core, believes that every life has equal value. And we work to help all people lead healthy, productive lives. In the United States, that means ensuring that all people, especially those with fewest resources, have access to the opportunities that they need to succeed in school and in life. At the foundation, we tend to take the long view. We think less about individual projects, and we think more about systems, about markets, about economies, about infrastructure. And we're guided by 4 primary values. And many of these values that I know are shared by our colleagues at the Sorenson Impact Center. Number 1, we're impatient optimists. We do take on problems that many others have already determined are impossible to solve. 2, we're collaborative. Even with the great resources that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has and its voice, we realize that we're only part of a solution to any problem, that we have to and benefit from collaborating with others like the Sorenson Impact Center and like many of our partners at this convening. Number 3, we believe in rigor, focus, discipline, and a rigorous approach to those solutions that we work on. And finally, we know that innovation and curiosity and creativity are required to solve the most intractable problems. In the United States, we're one of the largest philanthropic investors in education. And we do that because we know that post-secondary education is the most important engine for social mobility. But we also know that getting a degree has not been equitable and is not equitable. So we invest to increase college attainment specifically for people who identify as Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and who have low income and low wealth. The MAPS project is one of those investments, and through MAPS, we support hindsight, foresight, and insight. A little bit of hindsight, understanding things like why institutions have failed in the past and trying to predict those failures in the future. How historic biases in the distribution of resources over decades has created financial brittleness for some institutions. We support a lot of foresight. So things like upcoming changes in demographics, behaviors, and choices, changes in the structure of higher education, and specifically how that might impact different segments of students. Things like university closures, the growth of national scale institutions, and who is moving to serve unserved segments like education deserts, like those that are on the wrong end of the digital divide, or people for whom college didn't work the first time. And most importantly, for this convening, we support equitable insight. We know that the models and the numbers tell a story, but they only tell part of the story. We really value hearing from real people, gaining real understanding, that are doing the real work, that are impacted and involved, and who will benefit in the future from the solutions. And when we work with equitable insight, we're really trying to approach that from an asset framing. We know that individuals, when given the agency, have the solutions, and specifically students. So we are interested in student voice, but not only voice, in agency, empowerment, and action by students. This hindsight, foresight, and insights helps us to identify risks and opportunities and eliminate surprises in the future, or at least reduce those, in terms of our own strategies at the foundation. But more importantly, it helps shape higher education to work better for more people. Let me give you some examples of some of the insights. Here's one. Institutions that build for Latinx and Black students are more likely to thrive after the 2025 high school graduating class peaks, after the peak of graduates from high school in 2025. Number two, co-designing with students and next generation members really provides more robust and relevant solutions. And we've learned that especially as we have moved through the COVID pandemic. Some examples include the approaches to social justice, unbiased distribution of large amounts of emergency aid to the students that needed it most fast, the ongoing availability and use of online and hybrid delivery of not only instruction, but also of services and supports. And one more insight. Here's one. This is a good one on one hand. Not as many institutions as we feared were going to failed during the pandemic. But we're seeing some other trends that are worth watching. One, there is a long-term decline in community college attendance, and it dropped again significantly during the pandemic. Two, students are probably being impacted more by the elimination of degree programs and colleges and departments than they are actually by the shutting down of whole universities. Three, universities with national reach and sophisticated online learning platforms have really grown rapidly during the pandemic. And four, students with low income and Black and Indigenous students have been heavily impacted by health issues and job loss, and job losses for their family members during COVID. And there are some concerning numbers for the fall 2021 entering class indicating many of those students are missing. In closing, we believe that the Sorenson Impact Center, along with your foresight and your insight, is shaping higher education to be more equitable and also to provide even more value. And we at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation are happy and even more than happy, grateful to be your partner and to support you all in doing this important work.
Dale, thank you for sharing your thoughts and insights. We are so honored to partner with a change maker like the Gates Foundation in this work. I'm excited to share some of what we're working on and learning through the MAPS project today. The MAPS project stands for Model, Analyze, Prototype, and Share. The goal is to equip decision makers in the higher education space with the tools they need to create a more student-centered and equitable system of higher education. We use data, storytelling, and stakeholder engagement with both leaders and students to understand key insights about higher education today, where it's headed in the future, and how to chart a more equitable course. Through MAPS, we've looked at the demand for higher education in the future. Some scholars have predicted an enrollment cliff in the coming decade, meaning a significant decline in enrollment as high school graduation classes decrease in size. But our data has found that enrollment is more complex than just birth rates. The landscape of higher education is changing. The classroom of 2031 is going to be very different than the classroom of 2021. The effects of declining enrollment will not be experienced equally across all student populations. Race, place, and income all matter as does the intersections of these three. But let's dig into these dynamics a bit more. First, the proportion of 15 to 24-year-olds enrolling in post-secondary education is dynamic. Over the past 10 years, at an aggregate, enrollment has decreased while the population of 15 to 24-year-olds has increased. Among those who have enrolled in higher education between 2008 and 2018, the proportion of white students and Black or African American students decreased 8% each, and the proportion of total enrolled students of Hispanic students and international students increased 30 and 34% respectively. Finally, the proportion of all enrolled students who identify as two or more races has increased 115% over that time frame. This data just indicates that our populations are increasingly diverse, and our work suggests that Latinx students will drive much of the demand going forward. So these findings go back to the key insight that the classroom of 2031 is going to be very different from the classroom of 2021. But the effects of declining enrollment also will not be experienced equally across institutions of higher education either. When looking at the various sectors within higher education, again looking at changes between 2008 and 2018, the proportion of all enrolled students enrolled in public two-year institutions decreased 13%, while the proportion of students in a public four-year institution increased 4%. During that same time, the proportion of students enrolled in private, not-for-profit institutions remained relatively stable. On top of these dynamics, COVID has brought a decline in higher education enrollment. And while we do expect some recovery, we do not necessarily expect full recovery of all students that either left or decided not to attend during this past year. So putting this all together, here's what we see happening. As fewer students enroll in higher education in the coming years, there will be less competition for those seats, giving students greater choice. And students will be inclined to attend those institutions where they believe students like themselves can succeed. This is the bottom line. Institutions of higher education that will thrive in 2031 will be the ones who ensure diverse student success. And there's an opportunity for institutions and systems to act now. But what can they do? Importantly, enrollment also has a lot to do with value proposition. Not only are student demographics changing, but we also know the students of today have more dynamic preferences and needs. Many of them are working, parenting, or returning after time away, among a myriad of other circumstances. So there's an opportunity for institutions to consider the needs and experiences of their students in a holistic way. And who knows the student's experience best? Students. Overall, our project findings suggest that institutions need new tools and new perspectives to transform for the future. Through MAPS, we assert that students should be co-creators in the future of higher education. And next, you'll hear from two students involved in our work. When based on our work, the biggest takeaway is that students in general do not feel heard and understood in current structures. While a select group of students may take on leadership roles in student government and may be heard through similar traditional channels, the vast majority of students, often diverse students, are not heard through these traditional channels. And students want to work in deeper partnership with decision makers. Many institutions don't currently have strong processes in place for decision makers to understand students in a continuous way, rather than a point in time, like a survey. We believe that empowering students in decision making in higher education can help institutions better adapt to serve students, which can only increase the institution's value proposition and viability into the future. So our upcoming work with MAPS over the course of the coming year link these dynamics together. A few of our goals for this year. First, create a model that shows who will be driving the demand for higher education institutions in the next decade that takes into account not only student racial and ethnic demographics, but also flows across states and regions, trends in public and private sectors, and many other variables. Second, develop a tool that will help institutions understand how well they serve various racial and ethnic groups, and where there are opportunities to serve students better. Third, build a financial health model and dashboard to help both institutions and policymakers understand the financial situation of various institutions and the impact of that financial situation on students, particularly students of color. Fourth, compile our work with students across the country into a guidebook for institution and system leaders to better understand how to incorporate student voices in a substantive and ongoing way. And fifth, engage with leaders of higher education institutions and systems and policymakers to deploy these tools, understand their situation, and think through potential solutions and strategies for success in the coming years. Taken together, this work can help institutional and system leaders envision their future, assess their current capabilities to serve those students, and make decisions to better prepare for the students headed their way. In a world where the number of overall students is decreasing, those institutions that think about these dynamics are more likely to create a positive student experience and thrive. Finally, one more core principle of MAPS is open source. So we are excited to share our work publicly over the coming months and years, and we welcome conversations with institutional executive leadership and policymakers who are interested in a more equitable and student-centered future for higher education. We hope to both share our findings and to gain insight from practitioners to make our work stronger and more applicable. Even now, as we develop these tools, we are working with institutional leaders to reflect on how our work might shed light on their situation and how that information might be used to make their institutions more ready for the future. So please reach out to me if you're part of this audience of higher education decision makers and would like to be involved in our work. And next up, we'll hear from the voices that really matter, students.
The Student Coalition on Higher Education, housed under the Sorenson Impact Center's MAPS project, is a unique initiative led by young student leaders from across the nation. Garnering students like me from Occidental College, a small liberal arts school in the middle of Los Angeles, to students like Kurien, who attends the University of Virginia. Our group is eclectic, electric, and ever so passionate about equity and student centricity in higher education. Different time zones, different majors, different institutions, different racial and cultural identities. Our toolbox is fixed with an expansive breadth of perspective and experiences. As students, we are the nuts and bolts of higher education. Our voices must be elevated, heard, and considered as higher education leaders seek to chart the future of their institutions. This is what the Student Coalition strives for in all of our work. One major initiative of the Student Coalition this year has been telling the individual stories of students. Largely a lost art, but one that has the power to move people. It can inspire. It can ignite compassion and empathy. Most importantly, it can amplify the smallest and most overlooked of voices. In a year where a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic has shed light on racial and social injustice, it is very clear that these inequities exist in and can even be perpetuated by higher education. Our storytelling project brings a small yet incredibly powerful sample to the table.
Since the beginning of this year, our storytelling team has been conducting Zoom interviews with students from all across the country to understand their challenges, the needs, and the reality of attending college during the COVID-19 pandemic. We've spoken to students who had taken their classes from abroad, students worried about being immunocompromised, students that had lost their internships and part-time jobs, all of the above. This project unveiled new insights into the impact this pandemic had had on the college experience and how universities responded to their students' concerns. These concerns varied across the year, but the most consistent themes we heard across our conversations with students included the following. Challenges in transition and overall mental health. The pandemic itself was a form of collective trauma. With the sudden shock in routine and format of learning, students were forced to learn how to cope with stress and stay resilient.
I mentioned the living situation and kind of my academic experiences. However, one overarching thing that I had to deal with was my mental health. I've experienced anxiety and depression since I was like 13 or 14. I'm 22 now. And only last year did I get diagnosed actually, like, officially. And it's something that I've always knew that I had, yet I've always relied on like personal self-help coping mechanisms. When I got to college, those were refined a bit more, especially with some of the experiences I had. Yet when the pandemic hit, my brain just like, it exploded, it went off, my brain didn't know what to do, especially, do you remember the Black Lives Matter protests that were going on?
Yeah.
There were a lot in Los Angeles, and one of the main ones was literally right outside of my apartment.
Wow.
So
speaking of mental health.
Like, yeah, it was like I couldn't go to the store because there were National Guard members just lined up the streets. Like, the store is right across the street, and I didn't feel comfortable doing that. And then I just started living in like this little bubble of anxiety, and I just started feeling really closed in, on top of being really paranoid about the pandemic. Really, I don't even know how to describe the feeling: distraught, conflicted, sad, angry about the killing of George Floyd and the entire uprising around that.
Next, racial and social equity. The issues of racism and social inequality that have been brought into the limelight through the deaths of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd last year led to several student groups reconsidering how they were viewed in society, and it magnified the work that had to be done to ensure equal treatment and opportunity for all people.
It became very overwhelming, especially like as a Black person, to like see a lot of like anti-Blackness within my peers. It was hard. And I definitely I think I kind of made my circle smaller because of that, in who I regarded as like a friend versus an acquaintance. And I think it was a big moment of growth for me, as well as a lot of other people, because I really had to do a lot of like, kind of, this sounds corny, but like soul searching and like internal healing and stuff like that, just because it was really heavy to see all of that. And so I really just had to focus on myself and work on myself, and like offer obviously like whatever help I could to people who needed it.
Lastly, staying social. As lockdowns and social distancing restrictions led to a cancellation of so many in-person events and bookings, students were forced to find new and creative ways to stay in touch with their friends, classmates, and professors. Some had no choice but to take off entire semesters or limit their interactions to their quarantine pods.
I worked at our student government that actually paid us. So a lot of my friends were like in the same like job area, I guess. And so it was very like, I guess, nonchalant for us to just like, oh yeah, let's grab lunch. And then we're like, I just got out of class. Are you free to grab something? It's always like that simple. And then now I guess it's just really difficult because everybody else has like conflicting things of like, oh, I actually don't go on campus anymore because like I don't have classes there, or
Yeah.
And so just like the location has always been very convenient to see them and talk to them. And then yeah, I think this idea, it just feels really weird, even though like it's not, of like reaching out to people throughout this thing, because I don't know, I feel like everybody else is busy dealing with other things. Right. Like I have no idea what their like schedule looks like or what their day-to-day is anymore, because like it's not as convenient anymore, I guess.
At the end of our conversations, we posed the following choice of questions to students. 1, if they could go back in time to talk to their pre-pandemic self, what would they say? Or 2, if they could say something to a higher education administrator, what would they tell them? Here's what they had to say.
One thing that I would tell my pre-pandemic self is just to be patient. I think at the start of the pandemic, I was pretty angry about everything, that people weren't doing enough, or that you could have done this and you could have done that. But I think overall, we're all kind of just doing what we can and with the resources that we have. And it's hard to know the future. And so that's my advice, is just to be patient and accept the good that people put out. And just don't look for the faults or the lacks in the world around you, because there's definitely a lot, but I think that's my advice.
I think so. One thing that, as graduate students, we were pushing for even before the pandemic was more funding for mental health and counseling services at the university. And the pandemic has just brought that even more to the forefront. And so in terms of an administrator, I would say, okay, you really need to invest in the mental health services for students. And, of course they have some, but just really make even more available in different workshops and, whatever, but that's really important.
Listen to the students. I think sometimes they say that they're listening, but it's really just like they're hearing us and waiting for like a way to respond back, rather than like actually taking like what we're saying into consideration. And I think this was definitely true, like especially at the beginning, like the students on my campus all rallied together to try to get like the pass or fail option at our school. And we also did this because right before the pandemic hit, we had 2 students pass away. And our campus is really small. It's only 2,000 students, and both of the students that passed were Black students. So people were already dealing with like those 2 losses, and then the pandemic hit.
As colleges and universities work towards moving from this year, it's more important now, more than ever, to center ourselves and empower student voices. Everyone has a story to tell, stories that are unique and authentic to them. And from these stories, people can learn about literature, character, emotions, or culture of our universities. Or perhaps even gain a sense of urgency to seek change not only for themselves, but for their societies and the larger world.